Alfred.
Yes. And with that, then we'll keep moving down the agenda. Public comment in a special meeting under California law, public comments are limited to subjects on the agenda only. Therefore, public comment will take place during consideration of the item, where each person's comments shall be limited to 4 minutes. We'll now move to new business. This is the item on our agenda, 5.1. This is our city surplus property options council workshop. And this has been prepared by Planning Director, Ms. DeRosa. And I don't know if you're going to lead us into this or if our City Manager, Mark Presswich, is.
Take it away there,
Go ahead and
Mr.
get
City
it started. We'll go ahead and get started. And we have a PowerPoint that we'll be sharing periodically tonight. And I'll ask Cindy, our city clerk, to go ahead and post page 1 of that. Indeed, I believe that's the older version. So that looks like it had 3 pages on it. I could share my screen if you would like.
Yes, please.
Okay. And is everyone able to see this screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this is our city property workshop. And really, while the title discusses surplus property options, I want to say that the focus is really consideration of possible higher and better uses of 3 specific assets. And so this is a really nice opportunity to talk about some properties that we've anticipated talking about for quite a while. And 2 of the properties come via the city's lease that we've signed with Napa Valley College, where in about 6 months, we are planning to move both the City Hall, interim City Hall property at 1572 Railroad, as well as the city police station property at 1480, the home of the former City Hall, both operations to Napa Valley College, the Upper Valley campus off of Pope. In addition to that, because of the transition to Napa Valley College, this frees up some additional potential space for the city because there are some meeting rooms at the college that the city can rent on an hour-by-hour basis. It's similar space to what we have available in the Carnegie Building today. So we see that as a potential underutilized asset. The format for tonight's workshop is we're first going to receive a presentation from our city attorney on the Surplus Lands Act. Because there are some changes in state law that affect properties that are considered that might be considered surplus via a public agency. Next, we're going to receive a presentation from our community and planning and building director, and she will talk to us about the zoning code and general plan process along with CEQA, and include specific information about the 3 parcels that I just described. And then following those presentations, we're going to convene a council discussion, receive some public feedback. And what we're looking for is, and we recognize that this is really the starting point for a conversation, but we're interested in taking the temperature of the council on these 3 assets and visiting some questions about timeline, preferences, and setting in motion some additional work that will be needed should we have interest in seeing a higher and better use on any of these parcels. So with that, unless there are any questions, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our planning and building director, Maya DeRosa. And I will, I guess, run the screen here for you, Maya.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So yeah, we go to the next slide. Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm excited that we're talking about this tonight. And so I'll start with just some of the background reports that we looked at when we were putting this report together. The first one was 2015, a feasibility analysis. I believe that's attached to your staff report. And essentially that report looked at 6 sites, and 2 of the sites are included. The primary focus was residential affordable housing. So as you know, we're tonight, excuse me, we're looking at a variety of different options for the different sites. So we just wanted to give credit to the work that that consultant had done. And the second item relates to a RFP back in 2016. And this report actually, we just, I believe we attached it today to the staff report. And essentially what that did is identify that the City Hall site was ripe for redevelopment. And we received, I believe, 1 proposal for a hotel. And all the details are on the web link for that. And then moving to the 2017, there was a series of appraisal reports that was done by the Ward Levy Appraisal Group. And we have all those attached to the staff report. The essence of that appraisal report was to look at what is the highest, best use of these sites, and also what is the market value of these properties. So, you know, since this report also is not absolutely current, we don't put a whole lot of emphasis on the current market value that's noted in that report, but it is noteworthy to keep in the context of the discussion today. Let's see, and we can go on to the next slide. So the next 3 slides are going to go through an aerial of the 3 sites that we're talking about this evening. The first one being 1572 Railroad Avenue, which is, as you know, the location of our interim City Hall building. The site is 0.93 acres. It does also include the recreation offices and the annex buildings that are also used for the recreation activities. The general plan is a business and professional office, and the zoning is the same. The main criteria to keep in mind with what the limitations of this zone is related to housing is it only allows residential uses on the upper floor, and that also would have to be with a use permit. Next slide, please. This is the old City Hall site. You can see that what's shaded primarily is focusing in on the City Hall building and the police facility. It does not, what's shaded does not include the fire station. However, in that 1.7 acres, that number does include the fire station. So if we're doing net calculations, really the area that's highlighted is actually 0.88 acres. And you probably saw that in some of the other background information referenced. So this site unfortunately suffered smoke damage in late 2019, and the city vacated it. And so it has been the subject of lots of discussions, both presently and in the past, for a higher and better use. It has great frontage on Main Street and is also adjacent to Lyman Park. The general plan is central business, and the zoning is the same as well. Residential uses are allowed only on the upper floors for CB. And then we can go to our final site. This is the Carnegie Building. It is a historic building that is listed on the National Register. It has 0.13 acres, so it's the smallest site. It is currently, as most of us know, the operation of additional square footage for the Parks and Recreation Department, and also provides excellent additional meeting space for variety of community meetings and workshops. The general plan is also central business, and the zoning is the same. The interesting thing to note with this site in terms of sensitivities is it is across the street from a school. So we should keep that mindful awareness of that land use sensitivity when we talk this evening about potential uses for it. Next slide, please. And this is also included in your staff report. What I'm going to just briefly highlight for the council and the community of what's involved when we need to change the zoning, the general plan. A lot of this is already outlined in our zoning code, but just briefly with the timelines attached or indicated here, the first step would be to schedule a meeting with the city council. We would confirm that there is support for that general plan amendment and zone change. So with staff reports and how our calendar typically works, that's approximately 4 weeks. And then the next step, assuming there was a firm direction to move forward, we would complete an application, route that to other city departments for review. The completing the application probably would take 2 weeks, and then the routing to their departments would be anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, and get the responses back. We would take those comments and then plan a community meeting, and that is really important part anytime you're pivoting on what your land uses are, because we want to find out early in the process that there's community support or any particular concerns. And of course, as a part of that, we would send notices to all owners within 300 feet, invite them to attend the meeting, and then they would also be receiving those same hearing notices when the item formally went to Planning Commission Council. As part of that community meeting, we would get feedback, and assuming that there wasn't any pause or need to stop the process, our next step would be to prepare a staff report, hold a public hearing with the Planning Commission to make a recommendation to the City Council. So that would be weeks 15 through 19. And then we would finish the process at the City Council, who would have the final authority on approving the general plan amendment and the zone change. So right there, you're looking at roughly about 23 weeks. One thing that I also want to bring to the attention of the council is that this process here does not include the CEQA. So we would need to commence that prior to the actual Planning Commission public hearing. Thinking let's just talk about the Railroad Avenue site. If that was a mitigated negative declaration, we would go out for an RFP, secure the funding for that. So that could add a couple of months to the process. But this was primarily just focusing on the actual internal work of staff of what that timeline looks like for us. And I think the last item for my presentation, this is also in your staff report. This matrix just is nice because it summarizes on one page all the different options of what are we looking at for the general plan, the zoning, what's the current use, what would, if we were going to change the general plan and the zoning, what are some of those potential changes? And then looking at, of course, comparing the metrics of the lot sizes, potential number of units. But I think what's important here that we wanted to bring your attention to, which is going to be the focus of the workshop tonight, is what are some of those possible alternative uses on each of these sites. So starting with the Old City Hall, we, again, looking at that last RFP, we saw that potentially what was feasible to build, there would be a hotel. You could have a business incubator. You could have mixed use with retail and then housing above. So this is a very interesting site with, I think, a variety of options for the council to discuss. The second site on 1572 Railroad Avenue, I think both from looking at the Veranza study, our housing element needs. That's why staff has put in affordable housing, because if we can take the land costs away from a developer when they're trying to make their pro formas work, that's really huge in meeting various affordability target levels. So that's why we primarily were focusing on affordable housing for that item. And then the Carnegie Building, other options for that would include beyond Parks and Rec is commercial use. And that, of course, would require a general plan amendment and a zone change. So this is a summary that we can probably come back to if we need to as part of the discussion today. And I'm also available to answer questions now, or if Mr. City Manager, you want them to wait to the end, it's your pleasure.
Mark, or I think we're not getting audio from you.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we can pause now and ask some clarifying questions on this presentation. And of course, I jumped over the city attorney's presentation out of order. So we still have the city attorney's presentation before we have more formal conversations about council interest in next higher and better uses. Are there any questions on Maya's presentation?
I'm seeing Vice Mayor Doring.
Just to make sure I understand the City Hall property and what we're focusing in on in terms of the potential for that property. As you know, that last chart you showed 1.7 acres and I think 30, I don't know, I didn't see what it was, I don't remember, but that's really not what we're looking at, right? Where, as I understand it, it's 0.88 acres and less than.
And that'd be 18 units.
18 units only. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the clarification.
Okay.
And I'm seeing Councilmember Chateau.
Thank you. Just another clarifying question. When we're talking about Carnegie and it says option in the matrix Parks and Recreation offices, those are going to be over at the college. Is that right? Or are we still looking for a place for them to go?
I think it's fair to say that we don't have a solid location for Parks and Rec at this point in time. I do think that we have some expansion space right now that is planned to be used as a conference room, but that can be converted to a couple of offices for Parks and Rec. That's one option. Is we think differently about our conference space. Alternatively, we could also look to the library building for office space for Parks and Rec. So it's a large building. We can find a way to put 3 seats in that building. And then third, should the college at some later date rethink how they've allocated staff to their building, there is a classroom inside the college facility where we have split the classroom in half. One half will be our HR operation. I'm sorry, it will be, Maria will help me. I think this is, we've changed this up a couple of times. It will be, is it HR right now, Priya?
Yes, so one half.
HR, okay.
One half will be
Okay,
HR. Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And then the other half of that classroom is being reserved for approximately 3 college staff. There is a possibility that at some point down the road, those staff members could be relocated by the college to a different location if we had interest in expanding into that space. So I think there are a number of advantages of having the recreation staff at the new City Hall facility at the college, and I think we have space for them now. We just haven't formally designed out that particular room other than some desks for hotel stations as well as a conference room facility. I hope that's helpful.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other council comments, questions at this point?
Just a quick clarification, Maya, on your presentation, you showed the Carnegie as CB, I think, currently. The matrix shows it as PQP.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I was looking at the wrong column. It's PQP, and that to do anything other than city offices, it would be as a general plan zone change to CB.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so seeing no other council comments at this point, we'll go here to our city attorney, Mr. Walsh. And what we'll do is after that presentation, we'll bring it back for some council discussion, then open it to public comment and go from there. So just wanting to let folks who are on the meeting that we will have opportunity for public comment here coming up after the presentation and some council discussion. So I'll hand it now to Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So my presentation, I'm just going to give a very brief oral presentation. It's really just to give you some context on some changes in the law that affect this process and some kind of preliminary steps that we're going to have to go through before we could actually go through the process of selling this property. And that doesn't mean that we can't have these discussions at this point where we're considering kind of the policy ramifications of what direction we might want to go. But there are some steps that we have to go through under the new revisions to the Surplus Lands Act that will have to occur before we actually go forward with initiating a sale with with a specific developer. And so the changes in the law were put into place in 2019 by AB 1486. And essentially what that law was intended to do was it was intended to give kind of an additional opportunity for affordable housing developers to have what essentially amounts to kind of a right of first offer for properties that cities want to sell, whether it be because they no longer need them or because they see a higher and better use than what the city has used it for previously. And traditionally, a lot of cities throughout the state didn't utilize the Surplus Lands Act process very heavily. Oftentimes, situations like the one that the city is in today, we would find that property that we own maybe could be put to better use in furtherance of our overarching goals, particularly in the area of economic development. And so cities would go out to just a more traditional RFP to solicit interest from developers for property. But the changes in the law have made it so that essentially, unless you fit into very narrow categories that are exempt from the Surplus Lands Act, then you have to declare land to be surplus before you go through a process of, say, opening it up for an RFP for developers. So when you when you declare land to be surplus, what you have to do is you then you pass a resolution at the city council declaring the land surplus, and then you essentially solicit potential or affordable housing providers who've expressed an interest in receiving these notices, and the other public agencies to let them know that you have a piece of land that's available, and then you hold it out there for 60 days. If you do get a notice of interest from any of these parties that receive the notice of availability, is what it's called, then you have to negotiate in good faith with those proposing parties for a period of 90 days. And the preference in this process goes to affordable housing providers who are providing who are proposing to provide at least 25% affordable units on the property. And you have to go through this process regardless of what the zoning and general plan designation are for the property. So say, even for these properties that are currently zone CB, where you can only have residential in the upper floors, you would still have to open it up and make that available for proposals from affordable housing providers. If you aren't able to come to terms through that 90-day period, then you can move forward with any process that you want. But you do have to go through that good faith negotiation process for a period of at least 90 days. And it's especially important to go through this process because there are significant penalties if you don't go through the process and then you end up selling the property. The first time that a city were to do that, they would have to forfeit 1/3 of the sales proceeds, and that would have to go into a fund to fund future affordable housing. And if it happened a second time, you would have to forfeit 50% of the sales proceeds from the ultimate sale of the property. So you do have to be careful about this. And in addition, a new development that has taken place with AB 1486 is that the state HCD, the Housing and Community Development Department for the state, has oversight over this process. So when we adopt resolutions declaring the land surplus and then go through the notice of availability process, we have to provide documentation to HCD that we actually did that and get their sign up to affirm that we followed the process appropriately before we move forward with any other kind of sale. One final thing that I just wanted to note is that, as Maya noted, one of these properties we actually think may be a candidate for affordable housing. If you do plan to convey land for affordable housing, there is actually an exemption for that, and it doesn't fully exempt you from the process, but it lets you go through a more streamlined process where you can essentially go through a competitive RFP process for developers, and you have to invite a list that's maintained by HCD to participate in that RFP process, but you don't have to go through the multiple steps that I just outlined. And I know you received a sizable packet on this item, but I provided a more detailed memo on this issue in the council packet, so you can always refer back to that if you want additional detail. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, and otherwise we can turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Are there any questions from council at this point? I'm
Just
saying
one, I assume that you actually have to start the notice of availability process before you can respond to any notice of interest, correct?
Yes, you would have to. Yes, if you received a solicitation prior to doing that, you would have to wait until you went through that process to respond to that.
Thank you.
And I'm seeing Council Member Hall had his hand up.
And Ethan, can you please briefly recap what's the difference in the two different RFP processes? One you said was somewhat expedited that involved the HCD.
Yes, so if we were to propose, if we wanted to build affordable housing on one of the sites, if we actually, because the whole intent of this law is to get more affordable housing and to open it up for developers. So if that's the council's intent and we want to build affordable housing on the site, we could declare it to be exempt surplus and then put out an RFP requiring that any proposers provide affordable housing at a certain level. And then we can just go through a normal RFP process. We just have to open it up to a list that HCD keeps of developers who've already said that they're interested. And it's a lot of the folks that we would send an RFP on this issue to anyways. It's, statewide reputable affordable housing developers. So if we go through that process, it's more expedited, because in the first instance, you have to open it up for affordable housing providers. If you don't receive anything that you think is appropriate, and you can't come to terms with any proposers, then you can go to an RFP process. So it kind of eliminates that first step.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? I'm seeing Mr. Presswich, our city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. This is a question for the city attorney, and I'm hoping that you can clarify whether the Surplus Lands Act would apply in the context of a lease. So if the city was to lease property other than the Carnegie Building, where a subsequent project was necessary in order to achieve a higher and better use, would the Surplus Lands Act apply to that transaction if it wasn't a sale?
So HCD the law is not entirely clear on that, but HCD has developed guidelines that implement the law. And in their guidelines, they've taken the position that any lease of greater than 10 years is a disposition that's subject to the Surplus Lands Act. So if it was a short-term lease, to just get revenue while we were deciding what we wanted to do, that would be okay. But if it was a longer term lease, then it would be subject to the requirements of the Surplus Lands Act.
Thank you. So thinking about how we sort of keep structure in tonight's conversation, my thought, and I'm certainly open to input here, but my thought is that we begin a conversation focusing on Railroad Avenue, sort of move through that with council comment, then move on to the City Hall property, and then move to the Carnegie Building. Does that sound acceptable to the council? Once we discuss a bit, we can open up for public comment. Okay, I'm seeing some nods and no objections. So if we begin the conversation looking at Railroad Avenue, certainly housing is on everybody's minds, affordable workforce housing. And so I think this is a good spot to start as the city manager helped us understand the move over to the college opens up this dialogue. Is there any initial comment from council on the Railroad Avenue property? Thoughts about that?
Well, I have a comment and a question with
sorry.
respect to the assumptions that we're making regarding the availability of these properties. This is directed to the city manager. Is the assumption that you're making that we will be able to enter into a 5-year lease with a couple of year extensions, and that we will never need these properties again if indeed, my concern is what happens if the college decides, hey, we want this property back, we have better plans for it. And maybe we've already made a commitment to these properties. That may not prevent me entirely from making a deal, but I just want to know that we're thinking about that.
Right. I think that's a really important consideration. And in terms of having a plan B option or a plan C option for the City Hall parcel, I think it is foreseeable that given the transition to the college and our consideration of a couple of these other parcels, it would be in the city's interest to look at a longer term lease if there was an opportunity for an extension at the college. But should the college have different plans after 5 or 7 years, I say 5 or 7 because our initial term is 5 years. There is a 2-year extension that's available to us. And so we can think of that as a 7-year scenario. In terms of a plan B for options, we did look at other space in town that was available for lease. And we did consider options such as using Carnegie for a part of City Hall or all of City Hall. Frankly, we did have a potential scenario where in a cubicle environment, we could fit everyone in a very tight environment. It was extraordinarily tight, but the staffing that we had in City Hall would fit into that building, but it would not. It probably would not be comfortable. And so other considerations were that we did look at really 3. One later became not available, but we did look at 2 other locations where a portion of our operation could be relocated to. So if the market, if there was commercial space available, the market may have some space available for us. But I think my recommendation for a plan B would be to consider using the library if any of the other parcels were not available that we controlled. To look to the library as an opportunity to fit some of our staffing operations in, whether it's a portion or all of City Hall, to combine the library with City Hall until some subsequent incarnation of a City Hall type operation would work. I think for the police, that becomes a little more difficult because the police operation it requires specialty services, specialty technology, et cetera. And the pivot for the police department will be more difficult. The easier option from a pivot standpoint would be to consider contracting out for that service or looking to an adjacent city like Calistoga for some form of shared service. So we do know that the city of Calistoga evaluated the potential for shared services, and there was a dispatch operation that was considered perhaps more of a lower hanging fruit opportunity from a shared service perspective. But it's my understanding that the city of Calistoga is focused on continuing to operate their own police department and their own dispatch center at this point in time. But this is something that the vice mayor's question is really something that the council has to consider in the context of these other discussions about future opportunities with these sites.
Thank you. And
Understood. I think the police in particular is very difficult. We have to keep that top of mind, and you know, just in terms of a rollout of what you call a pivot, you know, government doesn't roll out as quickly as doesn't pivot as quickly as others. So I'm concerned that once we get to 5 years, we better have a plan. But there's a lot of discussion, obviously, and I know we're not focused on that property. We're focused on railroad for this discussion, but I just want to keep that top of mind. Thank you.
I saw Councilmember Chateau with a hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, I just to start it off with railroad, to me, railroad makes the most sense for housing. It's something that when I look at the locations and the property, the three that we're looking at, this is the one that stands out to me as a good site to do housing on.
Thank you. Any other council comment here?
I would generally agree with Anna on that. When I look at just these three, I think that one fits best for affordable housing. I was just also thinking about, Vice Mayor Doring's comments about City Hall. I think those are, it's a great question. And I just had a follow on, Mark. Do you think you could put all of City Hall in library and Carnegie, including police, if you put police at the Carnegie?
I think we could. The library is a large building. We never considered, we've been through a number of options and considerations over the past couple of years, and the police was an operation that we were thinking of a separate facility for a period of time. I still think there's a potential to add on to the fire station for a police station at some point in time by using a portion of the existing parking lot. That's one option potentially for building a separate police facility. But the more affordable option that avoids the capital investment would be to contract for service from a police perspective. And in thinking of the Carnegie Building, I don't know if that's necessarily a great location for the police department. But in terms of the library facility, because it's so large and there's so much space in that building, I think that's the building that creates the opportunity for us to consider reducing the size of the library collection if we were if we found ourselves in that situation. We have an approximately 17,000 square foot building that could be adjusted to accommodate certain changes in our operations if it was needed. And again, there may be other property on the market. For example, today there is a approximately 4,000 square foot commercial space that we did look at in the context of thinking through City Hall options. We did tour this space. It was available for lease, and today it's on the market for sale. And that particular unit is at the end of Adams Street in a commercial building. So, for example, there is a parcel, I believe. I know that the Director of Administrative Services and I looked at the numbers on that, and I'm forgetting exactly what the cost of that was, if you remember, but I believe it was in the $4 million range, and it was almost turnkey in terms of operation. It's a space that would be turned into most of City Hall operations, probably not the police department because of the neighbors in the building, but from an administrative perspective, it would fit our administrative operation pretty nicely, and that would be similar to the space that we're going to be using at the college.
Thank you. as we proceed in the meeting, just structurally, if council members could put up a hand, either physically or the electronic hand, to be recognized, just so that I can see where the comments are coming from when it moves forward. So thank you. Seeing Vice Mayor Doring.
I think this question is best directed to Maya. Is there a potential to, if we were thinking about rezoning a property or doing a general plan amendment, walk me through the potentials to increase density? I mean, are we sort of stuck with what we have and what has existed under our zoning district, or could we potentially create a new special zoning district or an overlay that allows us to create greater density for housing? Thank you.
Sure. That's a great question. One thing that I'll talk about that in our zoning code, the new one that I'm excited about is the mixed use. That's going to be a new designation we're bringing forward. And that is going to have up to an additional zoning for up to 20 units per acre. So, and I know the city of Sonoma, they actually have an affordable housing overlay zone. That's something we can look at as well. But we are, because of the general plan, that has kind of set what our limits are for density, same with the zoning. So unless we create a separate overlay, and then there's density bonus too that we can add in for certain levels of affordability. So we have to keep that in mind too.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm seeing Councilmember Chateau.
I just wanted more clarification on what the affordable housing overlay zone is.
Yeah, well, when we were putting the code together, we looked at other cities that had things that just were either interesting, or we were benchmarking our preservation standards against that. And I don't have a lot of detail on it, but I do know it's concentrated. I do believe it's a geographic area where they, and maybe it was for political reasons, where people just know these are the areas where we are going to focus on affordable housing. And, with everybody going through housing elements, that conversation may be very different now at the city of Sonoma, because everybody's having to maybe not be so restrictive, right, in terms of where they're identifying affordable housing. So I think, as we, look at, various options, the main thing that I think we can focus on, because of what state law allows, is the density bonus. And so essentially what that does is that, if you meet certain criteria of affordability, you can take what that base density allows, the highest range, and take up to 35%. And I believe there's even other areas of the state law that have evolved where there can be even more generous. And there's things such as, concessions to waive height, parking. So, because the idea when you talk about affordable housing, what really limits it is if you have all these zoning regulations that prevent you from, because you got to build parking, and it takes away from how much area you can actually devote to your building of your units. And obviously, the more units you can get on a site, the more you tend to increase affordability because costs go down. So it's kind of like there's a lot of moving pieces to that. But I'm happy to look more into that and bring that like what the Sonoma proposal is back to the council at a future date, if you're interested in, or give you guys a little bit of background report on that.
I don't need it yet, but thank you. That was good.
Thank you for that, and bringing up the special district, the zoning district. And as you said, what you've seen is geographic. And that's, I guess, what I was wondering, do the parcels necessarily have to be right next to each other to be in a district? So that, as maybe we'll learn more, that maybe there's some flexibility with that. The other aspect that I think it kind of, as we talking first about railroad, which I sense a general consensus in terms of looking at this for affordable housing. Some of the considerations at times with housing are the cost. And one of the developers that I had talked to in the past that has a project already in town here had done another project in another city that was a multi-site project where they came in and it was considered one project, but it was on a couple different pieces of property. And so they were able to get some economy of scale in building. So wondering, as we look at the different sites, if we can look at, if we determine that if perhaps the old city hall site is considered for some type of housing, could that be done at the same time as something on Railroad to find an economy of scale that it could be considered a single project? And that's just something to explore, I think. So with that, if I'm looking at the council and seeing a general consensus on Railroad Avenue to proceed in looking at what the options would be for housing, and in terms of the assets, the physical assets, certainly, we're looking at the other properties, just thinking about whether sale or lease. I'm always a proponent of preserving an asset, keeping an asset, and seeing if we can find a way to keep the asset and still maximize its use. But so the understanding with a housing project like Railroad Avenue is, in order to make it affordable for the developer, they would want to have some way to get the property that would not be a lease, but it would be transferred to them. Is that my understanding?
I think it's fair to say there are different approaches. So a very low cost lease is another option besides transfer of the property. But I think going back to the city attorney's comments, under both circumstances, the Surplus Lands Act would apply. And I know the city attorney has his hand raised.
I see that. Yes, Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Mayor. So with affordable housing projects, what you generally see these days, at least, is you either see a conveyance of the land to the developer where they own it in fee title, or there are a number of cities that have been engaged in doing ground leases where the city would retain the underlying fee title to the property, but then the developer owns the improvements that go onto the property for the length of the lease. So you do see that on occasion, but those are very long term. It's usually what you have is you have a 55-year affordability provision that would retain the land at an affordable level for that level of time. And then the ground lease would be somewhere in the neighborhood of an additional 30 years beyond that. So while you technically still own the land is tied up for an extremely long period of time. And that's usually necessary so they can get the types of financing that you need to do those projects, because there's generally, specific types of investment that are used to develop affordable housing. And there's specific structures that are used in order to make that work with the funding sources that you have.
Okay. And my understanding is that there's been success with things like that. I know that Stanford University has sort of a policy of keeping the asset, but doing these long-term leases. So if we were to look at housing at Railroad, could we be presented with a number of options about how that might be structured, whether it's conveyance or long-term lease? Could that be part of a report back with, what those options would be?
Sure, we can outline those options for you. And I mean, this is what's helpful about tonight, is having an opportunity to start to narrow the focus on council preferences, which often is you would like more information on some front related to, some of these or all of these parcels.
Great. So in terms of Railroad, I feel like there's sort of a consensus in looking in terms of housing. Do we want to move on now, unless there's additional council comment? Then we can move on to City Hall. And I think what we'll do is, once we get through an initial discussion of each property and sort of see where we are, then we'll open it for public comment. Unless there's a feeling that we should open it separately for each.
I think you have a hand raised now that's been up for a while, so I'm a little concerned that person may not stick
Very
around
well.
long enough.
Okay, so why don't we do that? We're going to open this up now for public comment and take public comment at this juncture. We'll touch base at each item then.
All right. Daniel, you can unmute yourself and address the council.
Hey there.
Hello,
Can everybody hear me?
we can hear you.
Thanks. I've been kind of sitting here churning and recalibrating my comments as we go. I mean, I'm greatly encouraged that we're having this discussion. I'm a little concerned that we're going to fall into the habit of focusing on a site, coming up with a dreamscape, and faltering. Whereas I think what we really need to develop is a holistic understanding of the entire inventory of sites that we have. You know, when we talk about housing, you know, I agree that the railroad is a tremendously powerful potential site for housing, but I don't think it's the only one that we have. I mean, I think the one really bright, shining point that we have in this city is an inventory of potentially, but currently dramatically underperforming sites. You know, railroad is one of them. I think there's a golden opportunity in the college relocate. You know, the relocation of the city hall operation to college. I don't think we should be fearful or let the idea that what happens in 5 years or 7 years dash that hope or that potential. You know, I think there are plans, there are schemes out there that exist for alternative sites. That have, you know, been developed. I mean, there's mountains of data out there produced cyclically by savvy members of the community, be it the SHAPE committee and or the infrastructure task force, where, you know, these sites have been examined kind of holistically, and you have to measure. You know, there are lots of ways to sort of skin the cat here, but you have to embrace the concept that you have to make some choices. You're going to have to be courageous as a council and make some decisions. Some of them will not all of them will be popular, but you're going to have to stop the habit of kicking the can down the road when it comes to, you know, both you know, workforce housing solutions, which the city and businesses desperately need. We're going to have to be savvy about this and be courageous about it. And I think I'm encouraged, but I'm a little, you know, I think the keystone of the workforce housing solution is land. You know, the city, thankfully and beautifully has some sites that can perform and solve that problem. You know, the corporate yard is one of them. The probably Railroad Avenue is another one. Those are super powerful nodes that could, and we have to, you know, at the same time, we have to start supporting the idea.
I'm sorry, Mr. Hale, we're at 4 minutes.
No problem.
Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you, got it.
Are there any other public comments at this point?
There's still 3 additional. James, I'm
Okay.
going to allow you to speak. You can unmute yourself and address the council.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council members, and staff. My name is James Kendall. I'm a representative of Carpenter's Local 751. Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. I wanted you I wanted to invite you to consider the opportunity before you with city-owned properties. You can choose to invest in the local community by including the workforce as you decide the future of these properties. Many construction workers that might work on these types of projects currently do not have healthcare and struggle financially. I'm asking for you to consider, as a condition of acquisition of these properties, the developer or general contractor should provide healthcare benefits and a livable wage to its workforce. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the public comment. And I'll look to our city clerk for additional comment.
Rick, you can unmute yourself and address the council. You can address the council, Rick.
Mr. Krebs, you may be on mute. We're not hearing anything.
I see that you're unmuted. Are you?
So why don't we circle back when and try again, perhaps at the next item, and then we can allow Mr. Krebs to speak there. Okay, we'll bring it back, and if he comes back in.
Okay.
So
There's no other
I'm
public
seeing
comment.
no other public comment. Okay, very well. So thank you, and we'll bring it back to the council now and move the discussion over to the 1480 City Hall property and see if there are any initial comments from council regarding this property. Seeing no initial hands up, this is an area where I do think exploring the idea of if there's a housing a possibility here, and I'll just sort of refer to what one of the public comments was, looking a little bit holistically about how they might work together. And I refer also to the comment I made about the multi-site project. So just one of the thoughts that I had is if we do see a housing component at this site, tying it in so we look for some economy of scale, I do also think that the concept of this sort of upper floor housing, and this again goes to talking about zoning, and perhaps we can find ways to get full density. But if it is upper floor housing, to me, that brings some vitality to the downtown area. I know that there are areas that have done this where there's some type of retail below and then housing above. To me, that's interesting. One of the concepts that's come up a number of times is the idea of co-working space and having cities have availability of space that people can use as a tech center or a business incubator. If the city has some control over rents, so there's a way to make it so a company can come in and build, maybe some potential there. But the idea that we've learned a lot from Zoom in terms of teleworking, is there a way to look at a business facility there that might work? I do also think that the proximity to Lyman Park, it would be a consideration to have some public serving aspect, whether it's a part of the library or museum. And also concepts have come up about some type of cafe that might serve the park area. But just looking at different possibilities for that site. So that's sort of what I'm thinking, but if we think about it holistically, so it ties in, if we have other opportunities of housing to do it as one larger project and maybe get some economy of scale. Any council comment here?
My general thought is I like the idea of something at this site that's a little bit more commercial in nature. It is fronting our main street. I like staff's description of it as sort of northern commercial anchor for our downtown, commercial district. So that's just my general thought. I don't know if it necessarily needs to be tied to another affordable housing property. I also don't think it's necessarily the city's job to offer up all of its dirt to solve RENA issues. I think we do have financing issues. We do have water issues that are still not resolved that all need to be considered, I think. I do like some of the comments I think that Mr. Hale was making in terms of other sites and possibly including them in some of this thought process. I know that really what's triggered this is our move out of Railroad basically and out of the old City Hall. So it's a good starting point to this conversation. I just think that there's 2 or 3 other large motivators for this council's thought process that should help feed into this as well.
Thank you. And I'm seeing Councilmember Chateau with her hand up.
Thank you. I have some different thoughts. One of them is that if we go too big and we include multiple properties, we tend to not be able to move forward and take action. And I really want us to be able to move forward, and we have to start somewhere. So I love the idea of thinking of it all and having this big master plan, but I could see with SHAPE how hard it was to actually take all of the ideas and the recommendations and the hours of work and actually turn it into something. So at this point, I really like the idea of us considering what's before us and making some decisions. When I think of the City Hall site, I'm open. I too think about it more in bigger principles. I want some sort of commercial activity there, or I don't know if that's experiences or like the mayor was talking about. Is there possibly a way to offer smaller space that would be less rents? I don't know what that is for people and businesses to get started there, but I'm open to putting that out to the community or RFPs or how we do that to get some ideas and see what could happen there. I'm open to being housing on the top floor if that's something that could work with the project. I don't know those answers yet. But when I think about it, I do really like the concept that I thought of before in terms of like, let's just take these buildings down as soon as we can and then use that space and show the community what it could be, even just as an empty lot. You could have events there. You could have pop-up experiences. We could charge for parking and have a parking lot that could actually make us some money as we move forward. We know it's going to take years to do, and really show the community what kind of community space that could be right there by Lyman Park and the experiences that we could have. So that's just one idea I had and I wanted to bring forward.
I'd be very supportive of that idea of taking the buildings down to open the space, if that's what we're going to have to do anyway. I do know that some of that removal can be very expensive. I remember in the last conversation, one of the last ones we had was, do we wait for the new idea to come in to help pay for taking down the old buildings? But I do think by moving those out, we will open up the space for ideas about what goes forward. So I do support the idea of moving forward in getting those old buildings out of the way so we can move forward with future ideas. Any other council comment here? And then I will open it to public comment. And I do think I want to recognize what the vice mayor mentioned in terms of a plan in terms of City Hall. We know we have a lease the next 5 to 7 years, but whatever happens there, we need to know we've got a plan for City Hall, so that this site ties into that as well. So I'm seeing no other council hands at this point, so I will look to Cindy to open up our public comment.
Okay, Rick, you can unmute yourself and address the council.
Let's see if it works now.
It works now.
We can hear you.
Thank you very much. I apologize for my earlier technical difficulties. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, City Council members, and staff. I thank you for this opportunity to speak to you tonight. And my question is really addressed to our city attorney. Is land other than that is surplus, declared surplus by the city, is it also subject to this new surplus land law?
Would you like me to answer that, Mayor?
Yes, if you're comfortable answering that.
So if I'm understanding the question right, do you mean are all city properties subject to this requirement?
Yes, sir.
Yes, all city properties are subject to this requirement. The only exceptions are properties, say, that are less than 5,000 square feet, or there's very limited exceptions for things that clearly physically cannot be used for housing. Other than that, if all city properties, if we want to sell them, we first have to go through this property or through this process.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll look for additional public comment.
Kelly, you can unmute yourself and address the council.
I'm still seeing a mute on the caller. There we go.
Good
Still-
evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, hi. Thank you. Thank you for taking my comments. Really interesting topic. I had a couple of points. One is it's very concerning to think about.
We're losing your audio.
How about now?
Yes, now it's good.
Okay. The thought of the city hall having to relocate every 5 to 7 years is just contrary to what a city hall means to a city. A city hall is a place like a school, and it should be counted on to be in a defined, constant place. So I know you're working with the college, but to not have a plan after 5 or 7 years, it just runs contrary to what a city hall means symbolically. I think it's really important to remember that RENA is not something that's imposed upon us. It's something that we do to try to work to help our neighbors and workers and members of our community. So I attended the county's housing element workshop today, and I think that making sure that every site does have housing component as a priority is very important. I think retaining the land, these assets entitled by the city is important. To lease them is preferable always over to selling them. And then lastly, I don't know if anybody else picked up on the irony of this. I don't know who mentioned it, but shrinking the size of the library collection in order to expand the police department. And I love our police department. They're nice people, but that just struck me somehow as something we don't want to do. We always want to encourage libraries and reading and public use of that space. And so I think that circles back to my beginning comments, is if you don't have a place for the city hall nailed, and you don't have a place for a police department, which is very, very specialized, even thinking of outsourcing that work, I think is controversial. If you can't come up with a place, say where the city hall and the police department is going to be, I don't know. Seems like you might need to make sure that you have that figured out before you release those other assets. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. And I'll look to our city clerk to see if there are additional comments.
There are no additional comments.
Oh, I'm, and then we'll bring it back to the council. I'm seeing Vice Mayor Doring.
Well, just a couple other thoughts I had in terms of, how we use this space or other spaces. I think one of the things is important. I agree. I'm not sure it's accurate to say that RENA is not imposed on us. I think it is imposed on us. I do believe we should respond to our housing needs irrespective of RENA, but it's certainly a prime motivator. I'm beginning to see housing as a strategy that has to be linked and is linked directly to economic sustainability. We have to have employees here in order to fill the jobs, in order to pay the coffers. So I think they go hand in hand in my mind. I think we have to remove the stigma entirely of what it is to provide employee housing. And so we have a huge commitment that we have to undertake, 254 units. And well, we're just chipping at it here. You know, obviously the discussion is much broader than this, but I do think it's important for government to focus in on what we can do now. And I agree with, you know, looking at things holistically. That's how I sort of operate my brain in my law practice. I'm kind of forced to do that, but I do think it is important to focus in on these properties and look at the opportunities that we have. You know, our mission statement talks about economic sustainability and providing housing. So, you know, government is the art of compromise. That's what we have to do and kind of find both. And so on this property on Main Street, I think we can maybe do both. I don't think we'll achieve either one, you know, 100%, but I think we can do both at the same time and try to activate the beauty of what I think is underutilized public asset, and that's the Lyman Park. So I can see businesses that have synergy, you know, makers that have been talked about. That could be at other places, but here where it's open, artisans can use the physical environment to create things and make money for themselves and for the city, and potentially housing on a second or third floor. I don't know. I think we can maybe do both. I think it should be primarily commercial, but I also think we need that housing. And I also want us to focus on, you know, if we do sell assets, I would hope that we would commit to using those funds for more affordable housing. Now, I know we have big needs in the city, but I just see that the need for employees is essential to a sustainable economy. We're really, you know, over 75% of our employees are commuting into town. It's causing traffic congestion. Those folks who have to come here are not able to spend time with their families and volunteer in their, you know, communities. They should be volunteering here. They should be living here. If you talk to people on Main Street, they're really struggling to get employees to stay, and that's one of the main reasons. So I see it as an economic opportunity, not just a handout. So that's I look at our obligation a little bit differently. I think the two are inextricably tied together. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. And I think those are excellent comments. And it does go towards our economic sustainability to really focus on housing and change, you know, perhaps the way we've addressed it in the past. So looking at what we're looking at tonight, and we do know that there are other city properties that can be, you know, talked about as we move things forward, but looking at what we can do, looking at the things that are achievable, if we look at Railroad Avenue as a place to start a process and say, this is the amount of units that we can get here and begin that process, and then try to combine that conversation with the City Hall properties to see if, as we focus on Railroad, that next step may fall into place a little bit. We may learn a little bit more about what it would take to bring in housing to that Main Street property. But that conversation about housing, if we can't do it all at once, how much can we do to get started and at least begin moving forward and show that this dynamic is changing and we are valuing housing, workforce housing, affordable housing, and having employees here. And as Vice Mayor said, people who live and volunteer, raise their kids here, et cetera. So that's the discussion we've been having on these two properties. Are there any other council comments on these properties? And then we'll move to the Carnegie property.
Just one follow-up comment.
If I could get a hand up, that way I can see where they're coming from. Thank you, Councilmember Hall.
Just one follow-on comment. We talk a lot about the cost of housing here as the sole source of our housing problem. And there's no doubt it's extremely expensive to live here. I've spent time in other cities that are a different demographic than ours, different economic strata than ours, that are larger cities with built-in workforces, with a lot of affordable housing in those cities. And I'll tell you that those councils are challenged literally with this exact same conversation, which is, where are all the workers? So I think we should keep in mind that while we are quite sensitive to our housing costs, there's also a broader national issue today that's keeping people out of the workforce. So clearly, if everybody comes back into the workforce, it'd be great if we had beds to put them into right here in town. But I just wanted to remind folks that there are other macro issues that are impacting us as well.
Thank you for
I agree with that, Eric. I'm not discounting that at all. I agree with that wholeheartedly. That's a good point to make.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think with that, unless there are no other comments on the City Hall property, we'll move now to the Carnegie Building and have a bit of a discussion on that. Does anybody want to start? Oh, I'm seeing our city clerk with a hand up.
So I see that Kelly has her hand raised again. I'm not sure if you want to open public comment or call public comment later again.
I think she just dropped it. And what I'll do is we'll get into
Okay.
the Carnegie conversation. And then as that develops, we'll open it for public comment one more time for that. Does anybody want to start out on the Carnegie topic here? I'm seeing Councilmember Hall.
Thank you. I think of the three, I think obviously this one, in terms of a city asset, is the best, fastest way to generating additional revenue for the city, just in terms of leasing. It's move-in ready right now today. It's it's a historic landmark. We're using it periodically, a couple of days a week, I think, for Parks and Rec, a couple of classes. But I would be in favor of looking at other tenants or finding a broker in town to get going on leasing this property. And she could begin by looking at the zoning and see maybe we don't need to change the zoning at all. If there is a PQP potential floating around that we might be able to put in the site, then that would be terrific. If we do need to change zoning, then this seems like, it would be CB or something similar. And even though it would take 6 to 8 months to change the zoning, we should certainly get going on finding tenants to lease it one way or another.
Thank you for the comments. Any additional comments here from the council? I'm seeing Councilmember Chateau.
I have a question for our city manager about the classes that are being used over on Railroad. We're in COVID, so I'm not even sure exactly what's happening inside or how that's going to impact all of this. But I like my question is, do we need more inside space that we don't have at the college yet? That this space we could use that for. I like the idea. This is one of them that I just think there's a lot of historical value. I like the idea certainly of the city hanging on to this property. So leasing is short term. So I like that concept, but I also want to stay open to what do we need as a community for community event space and class space once we lose Railroad.
So with Railroad, we have the Redwood Room, which when I arrived 4 years ago was full of goods and has since been cleaned up and turned into programming space that recreation uses for classes. And so it's a nice space to have. It's been working well for us. And but I will tell you that because of additional space in town, we've established a relationship in the past with a Catholic school and the use of their gymnasium. With the college facility, that large glass room can be broken into 2 rooms. There's some really nice outdoor space both in front of the building, between the building and the parking lot, as well as inside the corridor of between the 2 wings. And what I've also noticed in town is we have a number of other locations, whether it's a school gymnasium or a service club that has additional space, a church with an auxiliary room. There are a lot of spaces in town where we could lease space by the hour for some programming that the city could deliver through Parks and Recreation. If the Redwood Room is, if that particular site, for example, is its future higher and best use as a housing site and we lose some programming space, I'm not uncomfortable about finding other space for us to help deliver programming. And so I hope that's helpful on that front.
Barry, thank you.
Thank you. Additional council comment? Seeing Vice Mayor Doring?
I was just going to have a little dialogue with Eric. I'm just wondering, when you say focusing on leasing Carnegie, what in your mind would be the sort of the most appropriate mix of potential tenants there? How would you do that if you were king for a day and you wanted to have tenants come in there that maybe help meet our mission in the city, but also actually could be rentable? Have you given that thought?
I haven't spent a huge amount of time thinking about it, simply because it's leased PQP today, or it's zone PQP.
Yeah.
But clearly it would work as office space. It might even work as some sort of medical office. On the PQP side of things, this is sort of quasi-public, service, I guess. And so when I look at our downtown core Main Street, 2 or 3 blocks there, in our zoning subcommittee work, one of the things that we've discussed is looking at how to get the highest and best use out of that space that's fronting Main Street. Sorry, hopefully you didn't hear that. And so there's lots of tenants on Main Street today that don't generate the even today's tax revenue to the city. And so these would be things like real estate companies who like the Main Street, obviously, because they know it's a great spot to be. But those types of services, they do great at promoting our town, helping people settle in here, helping folks transfer here, et cetera. But the actual business in the real estate that they're taking isn't generating sales taxes for the city. So I look at those types of uses. You could say the same thing about our banks, which all these national chains here taking up lots of good dirt that could be for other higher, better uses. And similarly, this might be a good long-term permanent home with event space and programs and other things happening for the St. Helena Chamber. It's a great spot there right on Adams. It's in a historic building. The Chamber does a fantastic job talking about this town's history, our heritage, and that would seem like it would be a nice compliment to what they're doing. So those are the things I think about when I think about the Carnegie Building.
Good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm seeing Councilmember Hardy.
Thank you. I'd like to start with a question for the city manager. I have the recollection that there's a kitchen in the basement at the Carnegie Building. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I think about that. I think about the location. I think about conversations that I've had with a number of people in recent years about what kinds of businesses might not simply generate business activity and revenues of their own, but actually serve as a kind of magnet or centerpiece that has a real positive synergy with the downtown as a whole. And one of the themes that's come out of those conversations is the concept of a destination restaurant. I don't know. Well, I mean, I have some ideas that this isn't the right time to go into about how we might attract one, but in listening to this conversation tonight, thinking about the fact that that building already has a kitchen of some kind in it, which I'm sure has not been set up as a, health department approved commercial kitchen, although I could be wrong. I'm thinking not. I think about the fact that with the school property and the church with public quasi-public uses taking up, I think, the entire block from Adams to Tainer on the west side of the street, you've got a lot of space for evening parking there. I think a restaurant could be a really great use, generating revenue for a building like that, something that would fit in with the lease approach. I came into this conversation, with a lot of nostalgia for past public, quasi-public uses of the building. That is, where we met as a city council in my first term. The association with.
That was when the building was first built, right, Lester?
Yeah, no, I am that old. That's true. The Carnegie program of funding libraries in towns across the country is a wonderful history. But again, listening to you all, I could actually get very excited about that corner as a commercial property, and I think restaurants are one possibility. Although, one really does have to test the marketplace. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Are there additional council comments before we move to, I'm seeing Councilmember Chateau.
Oh, my hand went up, but I am very excited about that idea.
Very, very, very good. So a few of the thoughts I have on Carnegie, in a conversation with the city manager, the understanding was that revenue from a lease of Carnegie could help offset the costs of the new city hall at the Upper Valley campus. So looking at a way to move into something that would help offset some of those costs, I think that's a really attractive idea. In terms of what could be in there, to me, it's important that the structure of the building, the historic aspect of the building is preserved, but what's in there and what it's used for, I think there can be evolution. I do like, the idea that, and I don't know if this is the appropriate spot for it, but it's come up a number of times, this sort of idea of co-working tech spaces that could help be an incubator or a generator. I do think that also we have nonprofits in town that we work with. I don't know if this may be an appropriate spot. The fact that it's by the school, that it's sort of on that corridor, may make it a place that's attractive for people to come into and participate. The idea of some sort of medical application, I've been hopeful a conversation moves into this idea of some economic diversification that includes the medical aspects. We have the hospital here. We have a great foundation for really building a medical side wellness sort of approach. And so something there, the concern I would have with the restaurant is one I brought up years ago with another business on that corner. It's just alcohol use near a school. There may be ways to offset that in terms of hours and things like that. So I wouldn't, I'd want to make sure we looked at that, but that would just be a concern that I would have. And it may be something in terms of egress, ingress sort of thing. But that's just one of the points that I would make. But I do think exploring what could be there that would make the client, the leasee excited too, to be in that location, that historic location that's really at the heart of the town. So I'm very interested in that concept of looking at what a lease could look like. And so with that, I'll look to our city clerk to see if there's any public comment.
There's a hand raised. Leslie, you can unmute yourself and address the council.
Yeah, hi, Leslie Stanton. I was waiting for comments about Carnegie. I'm glad to hear that most of you realize how its historic nature, its beauty, how long it's been in the city. Years ago, I did some research on how we got a Carnegie library here. I took exception to it being called a surplus building. It seems we're getting away from that. And its highest and best use, I think, is to stay within the city. I like the fact that it's near the elementary school. I used to enjoy that kids had such close access to after-school activities there, and would like to see more of that again. Driving down to parents driving lots of kids down to the college location. I like the idea of getting out of cars and being more centrally located for children. Anyway, thank you for, it sounds like not thinking of selling the Carnegie Building. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. And I'll look to our city clerk to see if there's additional public comment.
There are none.
Okay, we'll bring it back to the council. I'm seeing Councilmember Hall with a hand up.
Thank you. Just one question for the city manager. Mark, do you happen to know off the top of your head, what's the difference in square foot between the library and Carnegie?
The library square footage is in the 17,000 square foot range, but some of that square footage, I believe, is attributed to the second floor and not really terrific space. So it may be better to think of the library in the order of 10 to 13,000 square feet of usable space. The Carnegie Library is approximately 4,000 square feet. It's actually quite similar to the CDF building that we're using as interim city hall. And about 4 years ago, the city had a lease that was generating about $100,000 a year out of the interim city hall facility on Railroad. So you can imagine if that building was generating $100,000 a year 5 years ago, the Carnegie Building with a similar square footage could offset the college lease by approximately 50%, roughly.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've gone through the properties that were on the agenda, and I know that, you know, folks want to talk about other properties down the road. My hope is that this opens up the conversation. We start to find a way to have some movement, and then we can, you know, look at other things. But if there's a way that we can, and I'll check in with Councilmember Hardy here in just a moment, but if there's a way that we can sort of summarize where we are on these three tonight to give staff some direction, or just summarize what that direction may be, that may be a way for us to move forward. I'll go to Councilmember Hardy.
Thank you. Well, I'll summarize my thoughts and see if this gives us some direction overall. I'm very keen on the idea of making the most out of the potential for affordable housing development on the railroad properties. That seems like a good fit for that location. The City Hall property, I think, for me, it's too soon to commit to a particular course of action for the future. I really like Councilmember Chateau's idea of starting there with demolition that opens that space up for lots of potential temporary uses. I have the hope, feeling that just doing that may help us develop a sense of direction for the future with it. But I do have a couple of related thoughts. One, it's contiguity with Lyman Park does make it a particularly appropriate place for public or community-oriented uses. And having once lived in a house on Pine Street across from the earlier iteration of our fire station, I'm going to suggest that close proximity to the fire station is not optimum for quiet residential enjoyment. Or to put it a bit differently, it really doesn't go very well with the siren. So I don't really see that as a great housing site. Mixed use of some kind I'm open to, but again, I think we accomplish a lot if we get to a point where we're putting out an RFP for demolition and get a handle on what that would cost and see whether or not we're prepared or have a way to fit that into our budget. And then finally with the Carnegie Building, and it seems there may be some agreement here, I see that as a property to keep, but one that I would be happy to see leased for commercial use, a source of revenue. And I think there's real potential there to do something that takes advantage of the wonderful historic character of the structure in a way that generates revenue for the city and adds something vital and really helpful to the whole downtown environment. Those are my thoughts, and I'd love to see us actually end up tonight with some direction for staff on all three. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing Vice Mayor Doring.
I just want to put out a question whether the siren issue is an insurmountable issue, especially as we become a full-time fire department. And the whole idea, well, there's a history behind the sirens, and there's obviously a practicality of having it. But is that something that is going to hold us back forevermore to do anything on that property? Because that seems to be troublesome for me, but it could very well be. I don't know about the practicality or legality of having a siren.
The siren's completely unnecessary. It's a physical manifestation of our collective nostalgia and our support for the volunteer fire department, which has value. But I had a conversation with a chief of a volunteer fire department in Forestville 20 years ago. And I asked if they were using a siren, and he said, no, they'd gotten rid of it and the pagers worked just fine.
Well, maybe that's a conversation we can have with our fire department and use the siren symbolically at festival times or something like that to retain that nostalgia, but not have it be a day-to-day thing if that's an impediment in terms of housing, which I think is really the critical issue, or a very critical issue here. So I think that conversation perhaps can be moved forward at the same time if we're talking about what a cost of demolition would be. And in a sense, if we're able to agree on Railroad Avenue moving forward in terms of looking at housing, and Carnegie looking at a long-term lease, and then on the City Hall site, if we, as we say, we don't fully understand or know what we want to do, but maybe a step is to look at what demolition that might range in terms of cost. And I'm seeing Councilmember Chateau.
I agree with moving forward on those three things that both you and Councilmember Hardy pretty much said the same thing, with, of course, adding, talking to our fire chief and fire department about the siren.
Yeah, and I think, thank you. And I do think there's a way of saying we can preserve those nostalgic things for special days and use them to recognize our history without it impeding our future. Any other council comment here?
I just want to make sure that I'm not on record opposing the siren.
I'll stand with you that we're working towards a solution.
I remain neutral on that issue.
I think we can find a way.
We're still looking.
Go
We're
ahead.
still looking for volunteer firefighters to help us on a part-time basis. So
So,
happy to pass out pagers.
Is there any other council comment? I'm looking at staff saying, Mr. Presswich, do you feel that you have direction on moving forward and looking at each of these properties?
Yes, I do. And it was helpful to have the follow-up conversation on City Hall, because I think that is the toughest parcel at the moment to try to figure out. It's nice to hold it a little longer. And in addition to that, I was planning to press you on feedback on some form of demolition of those structures, because they will be vacant for a long time, most likely. And I think you had a good conversation about that. We have some next step opportunities, and maybe preceding an RFP, we can try to obtain some cost estimates on what it would take to remove those buildings, and as well as potentially some look at some interim parking type of scenario, which can be potentially delivered at a reasonable cost, and or include some form of a revenue provision where if a portion of those parking spaces, maybe not all of those, so maybe not the existing parking spaces, but some additional ones that were created by the building, could they be a revenue opportunity for the city if there was paid parking applied to those for some of the visitors using those spaces for the downtown. So I don't have a timetable other than to tell you it will probably be early 2022 when we're ready to come back with some next information and convene another similar type of workshop or facilitated discussion on next steps with each of these sites. And I see a hand raised.
Thank you. Just a quick question about the Main Street property. The staff report mentions smoke damage. I thought there were also some plumbing issues there at one point. How extensive is the damage? Is the building condemnable, or is it? I know the city didn't want to spend money on it. Do you know what is that?
So I'm happy to summarize that for you. The building experienced a sewer overflow in February approximately of 2019. So we moved our staff into other quarters while the building had to go through a remediation, including installation of a new floor. When the smoke damage occurred in December, it really melted down some of the HVAC, and we used air, tried to purify the air over time. That really didn't work. And an assessment of the building determined that it's going to cost a lot of money. You'd have to replace all of the HVAC. There was potentially some asbestos issues associated with that. And preceding those two events, the city had commissioned a study of the building in late 2017, and a company called EMG did a condition assessment of this building. And there were two buildings that the city, that particular assessment said, please don't invest any more dollars in this deteriorating asset. And City Hall was one of those two buildings. The other concern I had just being in that building and experiencing those two events was that, and also noticing that preceding my arrival in those two events, I think we had some wires that began to smoke in one of the offices. I think the staff that have worked in that building for a number of years, and I'm seeing nodding heads, because we were concerned that if we tried to put the HVAC back together, that some other wiring would really, it may have been compromised because of the smoke damage. I think that building got very hot in certain locations, and it would really require probably rewiring the entire building. And the building wasn't built for the operation that we were delivering at that time. And so a couple of years ago, our public works department, for example, was spread out in the entire building. We had some people at the front of the building, some in the middle of the building, some in the back of the building. And it's a building that ran its useful life, and it's higher and better uses to come down in the future and be replaced with something else.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, with that, if there's no additional comment at this point, staff has direction, and we've heard from Mr. Presswich that they'll come back with next steps. And so want to thank everybody for the focus, the input. Thank you, staff, all the great work putting this forward, and the council for the deliberation and consideration. So thank you, and we'll adjourn to our next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, thank you.
Good night.